What's going on, guys? Your boy First Drew, aka First and Three Dots. I want to thank you guys again for joining with me on another segment of the Social Pirate Network. Today's topic is tax reform. Where does your pennies go, and where does your dollars go? Let's get into it.
The best constitution is one controlled by a numerous middle class, which stands between the rich and the poor. For those who possess the goods of fortune and moderation find it easiest to obey the rules of reason. They are accordingly less apt than the rich or poor to act unjustly toward their fellow citizens. Insightful words from Aristotle, from one of his many writings in the 4th century. He knew the importance of a balanced and equal society and understood that a progressive tax system creates such a plane. He continues, external goods have a limit, like any other instrument, are of such a nature that where there is too much of them, they must either do harm or at any rate be of no use. Aristotle argued that both sides of the extremes create turmoil in society. Those who have the most and those who have the least will find it difficult to follow rational principle. Those who have too much of the goods of fortune are neither willing nor able to submit to authority. On the other hand, the working poor, who are in the opposite extreme, are too degraded. Thus arises a society not of free men, but of masters and slaves, the one despising and the other one envying. A society ought to be composed of equals and similars. These are generally the middle classes. Where the number of the poor is more than proportion to the wealth of the rich, there will naturally be a democracy. We've all heard the term, the only thing promised in life is death and taxes. We often equate this quote to Benjamin Franklin, but the quote of that phrase comes from Daniel Defoe in his book, The Political History of the Devil. He writes, things as certain as death and taxes can be more firmly believed. One of the earliest parts of our history on taxation begins with the colonial protest that led to the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a colonial revolt against the British and its tax policies in the late 1700s, which led to the independence of the 13 colonies. You may have heard the term, no taxation without representation. That term summarized the grievances that the colonists had towards the British. Many of them believed that since they were not directly represented by the Parliament, any laws placed on them were illegal under the Bill of Rights, which was implemented in 1689. After the colonists gained their independence, many of them felt it was time to create a new government, instead of continuing the old one. Remember, we had a different type of government before the Constitution was drafted. And at this time is when things start getting interesting. During the debates at the Constitutional Convention, which were held from May 25th to September 17th, 1787, there were many arguments on what the role of government should be. James Madison, one of the key figures in constructing the government, had an argument. His argument was that although democracy was the best way to constitute government, he pointed out the flaws. He suggested that if the United States were truly a democracy, that everyone would have a free voice, and everyone would play a role on how democracy would play out. Meaning, the much poorer of the land, which represented the majority of the population, could vote in favor of taking from the rich, which represented the smaller population. In his eyes, this was unjust. So he argued democracy should be limited and should be left in the hands of the few. He says the role of government should be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. In other words, one set of rules for the rich that should be protected, and another set of rules for the working poor. And essentially, that's how our new government was designed. On August 5th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Revenue Act. America saw its first income tax. It was a flat tax of 3% on annual incomes over $800. It also levied various tariffs on imports, including sugar, tea, nuts, coffee, liquor, and other various fruits and herbs. It was prompted to help fund the Civil War. The following year, on July 1st, 1862, another Revenue Act was passed by Lincoln. The act established the Internal Revenue Service, a department in charge of collecting taxes. This act also introduced the first progressive tax system in the United States to provide funding for the country for debt and other purposes. In 1895, a Supreme Court case, Pollock v. Farmers Loans and Trust, ruled that unapportioned income taxes on interest, dividends, and rents were in effect direct taxes and were unconstitutional because they violated the provision that direct taxes be apportioned. Apportionment is the idea that we view the census as a link to the correlation to direct taxes, based on the census of the state. For example, larger states like California could have a larger direct tax. Pollock was suing Farmers Loan and Trust because he owned shares in the company, and the company was paying a 2% tax on incomes over $4,000, which was implemented by the Wilson-Gorman Act. And the Supreme Court unfortunately agrees. So they cut a stream of revenue by stop taxing dividends, which is basically money that makes money, but still tax labor, which the majority of the country pays, so it shifts the burden. Again, just like how we saw demonstrated during the debates, one set of rules for the rich, another set of rules for the working population. And we see this type of disproportionate governing continue to worsen over the decades. On February 25, 1913, Secretary of State Philander C. Knox certified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. This new addition to the Constitution allows the Congress to levy any income tax without apportioning it among the states or basing it on the U.S. Census. During the early to mid-1900s, taxes were used to help finance governmental operations and was geared towards the benefit of the country. By 1918, the top rate of income tax was increased to 77% on income over $1 million. That will be equivalent to over $15 million in 2012 dollars. These funds were allocated to finance the First World War. The average rate for the very wealthy, though, was only 15%. In 1922, the top marginal rate was reduced to 58%. We started to see it continue to decline, and by 1929, it was at 24%. On October 29, 1929, America saw the worst period of its history with the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression was devastating and affected Americans across the country. Unemployment rose to 25%. In an effort to stabilize the country, President Herbert Hoover signed the unemployment and drought relief bills. But unfortunately, America would not see any real effects of economic improvement until President Franklin D. Roosevelt came into office. In 1933, the top marginal rate rose to 63%, and steady increase throughout the Depression, reaching 94% in 1945 on income over $200,000. Which would be equivalent to over $2 million in 2012. During the Second World War, Congress introduces payroll taxes, which helped contribute to Social Security, a massively successful program for retiring seniors. President Roosevelt implemented the New Deal, which was a series of public work programs, governmental reforms, and financial regulations. It included new constraints and safeguards on the banking industry and efforts to reinflate the economy after prices had fallen sharply. Over the decades following the New Deal apparatus, America saw great economic growth, especially in manufacturing. Some historians argue that it was slow growth, but nevertheless, these programs provided by the government, which were publicly funded by taxes, led to what was called the Golden Age of Expansion, or the Golden Age of Economics. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the bottom half of the country was doing just as well as the top half of the country. Corporations were handling over 33% of the federal tax revenue and were still generating great profits. With new financial regulations in place that separated commercial and investment banks from risky investments, we saw 50 years with no financial crashes. During the Golden Age, a man could provide for his family, join a good union, his wife could stay home, they could take vacations, send their kids to school without worry of immense debt. The American dream had been born, but that dream wouldn't last long, and by the 1970s things started to change. During the late 70s, we started to see a shift in the economy. Manufacturing started to dwindle, and the financialization of the economy started to dominate. Corporations started to realize they could make more profit in moving money around in provocative ways than they could in productivity. And on August 13, 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed into law one of the largest tax cuts in U.S. history, a law that was mainly beneficial to a small portion of the population and multinational corporations. The tax plan was framed as trickle-down theory, a theory that if you cut taxes on corporations and cut government regulations, that would free up capital and allow for investment that would trickle down on the rest of the population. The top rates were cut from 70% to 50%, but things didn't go as planned. David Stockman, the former budget director for the Reagan administration, wrote a book critical of Reagan and his own work titled The Triumph of Politics: Why the Reagan Revolution Failed. When Reagan left office, the deficit grew, and we had entered another recession, mainly due to no growth in wages and unemployment, amongst other deregulations. On August 10, 1993, President Bill Clinton signed into law the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. The act created a new bracket for certain earners and raised taxes on higher income. It also removed the cap on Medicare tax and increased benefits on Social Security with the tax increases from the bill. The government was able to raise additional revenue, which helped balance the budget, and by the end of the 1990s, Clinton left office with a surplus. The 90s saw economic growth, but the tech boom helped create that. On August 22, 1996, Bill Clinton signed into law the Personal Responsibility and Work Reconciliation Act, commonly referred to as the Welfare Reform Act. The slogan was to end welfare as we know it. The bill was devastating to a large portion of the working poor population and completely gutted the social safety net programs. One of the most current talking points under Trump's administration is undocumented immigrants receiving federal funds and welfare. This is not true, according to the bill that was enacted in 1996. If you're an undocumented immigrant, you receive no federal government assistance, and that has never been repealed. During the Bush years, more trickle-down policies were implemented. More cutting corporate taxes and more deregulation. The surplus that Bush inherited quickly became a deficit. The economy started to sink, growth declined, jobs were lost, and we had a huge recession. Then in September of 2008, Congress, along with the help of then Secretary of the Treasury, who was also CEO of Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, ushered in legislation that cost taxpayers $700 billion. The details of the act were also restricted to review by any court of law. These powerful corporations and financial institutions that crashed the economy were rewarded for their behavior at the expense of the American taxpayers. On December 22, 2017, President Trump signed into law the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This bill is a little tricky because essentially everyone sees a tax cut in the beginning. It's what's called a sunset provision. So anyone making $75,000 a year or less, which is a majority of Americans, will see a tax increase by 2027. Certain deductions, like teachers' school supplies, will no longer be eligible. Our seniors will see an increase in their premiums. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, it increases the deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. The corporate tax rate has been reduced to 21%, and that's only the nominal rate, not the effective rate. The effective rate is much lower. The whole purpose of this tax bill was to turn billions of dollars over to corporations under the false pretense that they would use that money to create jobs, increase wages, and invest more heavily than they have been. But there is little to no evidence of this. 90% of that is going to stock buybacks, dividends, and other forms of capital interest. The bill has nothing to do with jobs and everything to do with profits. Recent studies conclude that higher wage jobs have been replaced with smaller wage jobs. Between 2005 and 2015, 94% of all jobs that were created were either part-time or temporary. The United States tax system is not designed to help average Americans. The majority of our tax dollars are going to financial bailouts, corporate subsidies, and the military-industrial complex. Taxes are necessary to cultivate a civilization. Tax dollars should be allocated to the benefit of the American people, such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and civil workers. But unfortunately, systems of power have perverted their purpose.
Are you guys starting to see the trend here? Cut corporate taxes, cut government regulations, and what's the end results? When it comes to healthcare, education, infrastructure, all the things that our taxes should go to, that's when they want to scream small government. Government is your enemy. But when it comes to multinational corporations, financial institutions, and private enterprises, it's blank checks all the way around, using your tax dollars. In 1989, a real estate developer by the name of Leona Helmsley was indicted on tax evasion. At her trial, she infamously said, "We don't pay taxes, only the little people do." Our next video, the topic is healthcare, the price of wellness. I'm going to say it now, I'll say it forever. I want you guys to be informed, be inspired, and be involved. We'll talk soon. Thank you.